Shalom. So we've had all kinds of the machines are revolting this morning. As you notice, this is the problem when you've got a lot of integrated systems, right? The owl went off a couple of times, but I don't know if the problem is the owl or the problem is the laptop that the owl is connected to, or the problem is the Wi-Fi in here. It could be any of those things. Similarly, I know it's cold. Believe me, I know it's cold. Okay, but of course we are God's frozen people, so but we'll try and figure out why. I mean, I know why it's cold. The heating was not on this morning when I got here, but why that I don't know. So we'll look into it. Anyway, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the Torah reading, the Parsha is called Chayyei Sarah, which means the life of Sarah, but it is actually, not only does it begin with the death of Sarah, but it's bookended by death, because it begins with the death of Sarah and it ends with the death and burial of Abraham. Now, why do we call a Parsha which begins with death and ends with death? Why does it have a name that contains not death, but life? Right now, first of all, obviously there's just a technical reason that the Parsha begins with the first major word or the first major phrase in it, but of course, where Parshiot begin and end was not given by God at Mount Sinai, right? It was chosen by the sages. And, they probably chose this specifically so that it would be called Chayyei Sarah, the life of Sarah. There's a tradition in Judaism for using euphemisms, right? There are a couple of phrases. One Hebrew name for a cemetery is Beit Hayim, house of life. And another is Beit Olam or Beit Almin in Aramaic, which means house of eternity, right? But in general, Judaism, there's a focus on life, right? We read in Psalm 30, I don't necessarily go for the older translation, but the old 1917 JPS translation, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy cometh in the morning, right? And in Ketubot 17a, there's a discussion of a funeral procession and a wedding procession that meet at an intersection that's too narrow for both of them simultaneously. I imagine this is kind of like a Y intersection, where they're coming from different directions, but they have to go down the same street, and the funeral procession and the wedding procession, and if they can't go simultaneously because the street is too narrow, who gets priority? Right. The wedding, right? And in practical halacha, if your wedding was planned, right? Your wedding was planned for a certain date, and God forbid somebody that you have to sit shiva for dies right before, halachically, you get up from shiva to go to your own wedding. God forbid, obviously, but halachically, that's what you do. Or even if it's not your wedding, if you're somebody whose absence would cause the wedding to be delayed, right? So I'd have to look at it. I've never had a situation, but if I'm sitting shiva and I'm the officiant at the wedding, or Hazan is sitting shiva, and if we couldn't do it, the wedding wouldn't take place, then we get up from shiva and do the wedding. All right, that's the halacha. So weddings take precedence over Okay, and so Sarah now dies, and what does Abraham do? He buys a burial place for her. Now you might say, well, of course, I mean, got to bury her, right? But the Hittites say, go ahead and bury her. Go ahead and bury her. But Abraham says, no, I want to buy it because I want it as an ahuzah, right? An ahuzah is from the Hebrew word le'ahoz, which means to grasp, right? In other words, what is the difference between what the Hittites wanted to give him for free and what he wanted, right? They wanted, in other words, to give him a license to bury Sarah, but he wanted possession. He wanted ownership. Now it's interesting, and I don't know what in Maryland law, do you own your cemetery plot or do you have a license? Yeah, I don't know.
As far as I know, I haven't studied it but as far as I understand, you own that. It's deeded to you.
Okay, so is it like it's registered with the county and everything, or?
Well, I think you own it through the cemetery.
Okay,
So,
right, but he wants to actually own it. So the first thing is he buys a piece of property, and then he sends Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac, right? Who is 37 years old and unmarried and still living at home, right? But even in the midst of death, we give priority to life, right? The mourner's cottage does not mention death, right? And this is one of the conflicts that I have with people, right? Well, why do I have to have a minion to say cottage? And obviously, look, you know, I'm not the cottage, right? If you want to say cottage by yourself, no one's going to stop you, right? But it's not, but the ritual, first of all, it requires a minion because it requires your community to help you, and it requires you to need the help of the community so that you're not totally isolated, right? And that's why we have rules for Shiva and Shloshi, because the tradition says mourn and then get back to your life. Okay, it doesn't mean that you don't continue to grieve, right? I mean, you know, everybody here has lost somebody close to them, right? The grief in a certain way never stops, right? The grief never completely stops, but if we remain sunk in that grief and that's all we think of, we can't go on, right? And so we don't get stuck in mourning, but we continue to build for the future, okay? And that, and the word, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, God enters our lives as a call from the future, right? God is beckoning us from the far horizon of time to take a journey, undertake a task that we may not fully understand, but is what we were created for. And this is the meaning of the word vocation, right? Literally, vocation means a calling. It's a mission, a task to which we are summoned. Okay, and for each of us, Rabbi Sachs says, there's something God is calling on us to do, a future not yet made that awaits our making, and it's a future orientation that defines Judaism as a faith, okay? And one of Sachs's greatest points, and you can agree with it or not agree with it, but Sachs says that the idea of hope and that the idea of progress was introduced to the world by Judaism, right? That other ancient religions saw life as cyclical, right? And if you look at the Hindu idea or the Buddhist idea of nirvana, what is it? It's getting off the wheel, right? There's no better future. There's no better future. It's just a circle. The better future is for you individually. Get off the wheel, right? But Judaism says, no, there is a better future, or there can be a better future, but it's up to us to build it, and we have the wherewithal to do it, okay? And I want to read you a paragraph that Sachs wrote, and he wrote it years ago, right? I mean, this week was his second yahrzeit. Okay, so he wrote it a long time ago, but think of this paragraph in light of certain contemporary events. He says, so much of the anger, hatred, and resentments of this world are brought about by people obsessed by the past. Right, I'll read it again, because I didn't write it, and Sachs wrote it a long time ago, but it's spot on. So much of the anger, hatred, and resentments of this world are brought about by people obsessed by the past and who, like Lot's wife, are unable to move on. There is no good ending to this kind of story, only more tears and more tragedy. The way of Abraham in Chayyei is different. First, build the future, and only then can you mourn the past. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Continue with the Kaddish before